Today in Roach Reflections I want to talk about swims that I call them square yard swims. That sounds an odd thing. These are the sort of swims, and I'm going to talk about two in particular, where you're on quite a big bit of river that's 30, 40, even wider, 40 yards wide, and you're fishing a swim where you've got a crease, a big back eddy, and right on the edge of that flow is where the big roach are. And often the conditions have to be just right to catch those roach, but that's where they are. And when you feed the swim, the feed is going down to that particular spot, and that's why the roach are there. They're always there for a reason. The first swim, the one that I'm probably associated with from years ago, was Wareham Quay. Over the many years I've fished it, and we're talking over, well, getting on 50 years now, the currents there have changed because above the bridge and below the bridge the sandbars and the gravel bars have moved. Not a great deal, but very slowly above the bridge, the inside of the bend, if you like, so if you look upstream, the left hand bank is very slowly silted up. The boat mooring stages have gradually accumulated more mud close in, and the river has pushed across away to the right hand bank. So the way that current comes down through Wareham Bridge, South Bridge there, isn't the same as it was 40 years ago. And what that means is the back eddy that's on Wareham Quay near the bridge, not far below the bridge, is less stable than it used to be. It used to be a lovely back eddy that you could cast in there and trot towards the bridge, but not too close to the bridge. A lot of people have fished that swim and caught a lot of big roach fishing right against the bridge stanchion there, and I've never favoured fishing there. It's not to say there aren't roach there. The roach will go where you feed them, but I found that as the water dropped off into the deep hole right on the edge of the fast current, and using a big float, my old favourite balsa float that took 5 AAA shot, the old Ivan Marks one with a thin tip, that was about 3 foot deeper down there. It shelved off gradually, and when the current was right and the river had to be up a bit, not too much, but a tinge of colour, mild, and in the winter, sometime after mid-December probably, and going right to the end of the season, that was the spot where the roach were. And feeding maggots, which was the usual bait, but sometimes ground bait, that's where those fish ended up, and that's where I was able to catch them. Now in the years since then, in more recent years, people have fished much further down the quay, trotting down past the granary and so on, but that hotspot was very, very good, and it was so good that every September on a really low tide, that autumn equinox tide, I would go down there with waders, some years certainly, and with a very big strong rake, and get as far out as I could and into that edge of that hole and rake out the snags, the rocks that had accumulated over the summer, where people threw rocks off the bridge to make a big splash and stuff like that. So the swim was snag free back then. Now if you try and fish the same swim, some years certainly the snags are there, that the rocks do move over time with the big floods will shift them, but it's not unusual to try and fish that swim and snag up quite badly. Of course, once people start snagging in a bit like that with feeders and things, you end up with a load of strong line down on the bottom wrapped round a rock, and you're snagging in there snag. But as I say, the current has changed, so instead of forming a nice back eddy, what happens now much more if you try and fish that same spot is that you get it so it's a nice back eddy very briefly for maybe 30 seconds, and then it destroys itself. It's almost like the current goes over and rolls over where you've got your float holding nicely and pushes it out of the way. So that means that you suspect that the roach won't hold down on the bottom anymore the way that they did before. and so as a hotspot it's lost its luster, if you like. But that type of swim is something to look out for. There are other places where you get a similar thing on the upper Stour. The other swim that had a similar square yard was on beat 1 of Throop. I started to fish beat 1 of Throop in the very late 80s, and back then going on up from the New Weir, it was quite popular with roach anglers. When the river was up about a foot, you'd get anglers on both banks on the trotting swims, both sides, all the way to past the first bend. Not many people went up beyond that. There weren't so good swims above that until you went a lot further up, almost opposite Bounds Farm. But as you went round that, as you look upstream from New Weir, about getting on for half a mile up, there's a huge great bend, a double bend, and on that bend in the late 80s there was a nice trotting swim fairly close in, about 3 rod lengths out, about 12 to 14 yards out, and it was a good depth, probably 7 or 8 feet. But then as we went into the 90s, gradually as the current ate away at the far bank, the river moved. The river was moving, as they always do, to the east, and that meant that what was a trotting swim on the inside started to become a big slack, a big deep slack. And around about 20 years ago I went back to start fishing it again. In the interlude I'd sort of been match fishing, not really done so much roach fishing, but as I got back into my roach fishing around about 2000, I started to go and fish this swim, and I realised that with a very big Avon float, 12 BB, 13 BB Avon float, I could go right out into the middle of the river, right onto the edge of that crease again, and with a favourable wind. And that swim was good with a westerly or a southwesterly. You didn't want a real southerly, and certainly not a northerly. And throwing ground bait a good long way, mixed pretty solid, fishing bread, it was possible to catch big roach right on that, right out into the middle of the river, fishing around about 12 and a half foot deep. And doing that I caught some good roach. I caught a couple over £2, quite a few over £1, plenty of what we might call shoal roach, sort of 4-6 ounces, 8 ounces. But it had to be in that spot. You could fish the slack close in and you'd catch those small roach, but the big ones had to be right out in the middle there. The first big one I got out there, the one of 2-3, and I'd had plenty of good catches before that. The float almost dragged under right out in the middle. The river was rising. The day before I'd had 5 over £1, which was a good catch for that swim. But overnight rain coming down, the river had come up a couple of inches. It was quite hard, struggling for any bites. I was fishing out in the middle there, inching it through, and the float sort of slowly dragged under, and I thought, I don't know, I'll just ease it back above the water again, just increase the pressure. So holding the rod really right up in the air, keeping that line off the slack there. And with that, the float jagged under quite hard, and I struck and had this big roach. So it was almost like the roach was hanging onto the bread, and when I tried to pull it away from it, it pulled back. That swim since then has gradually formed, the slack is becoming a mud bank. It's easier to fish the swim now. It's the site of where the Red Arrow crash was, just immediately above there. And when they did the recovery work, they took a digger down there and they dug some of the bank out for access to get to the wreckage. And so instead of fishing, wading in the water as I did years ago, you can now stand on firm bank. But as that slack has developed, it's in the middle of it, there's a great mud bank. So instead of being 8 foot deep close in, it's, even with the river up, it's only a couple of feet deep, and gradually that will form firm ground as the reeds get on it and it silts up more and more. Maybe some branches or willows will take root on it, and that swim will change forever. It may not even be fishable for much longer. But it's a good example again of the sort of swim where you need to think about where are the fish. One or two swims I fished on the Avon this year were similar, ones that I might hopefully revisit next season. It won't happen this season, I don't think. But these hotspots are worth looking at carefully. Just because you've got someone says, oh, this is a good swim, go and fish there. Find out where they're fishing in that swim, where you feed it, where your feed ends up, and what sort of presentation you need. And quite often you need quite a big float taking plenty of lead to present it correctly. I hope I've got you thinking in this series. There's still plenty more to come. To come up with more and more ideas. Plenty of people make comments that inspire me to do different things. Please click like and subscribe, and cheerio for now.